I spent more than 25 years as a congressional reporter covering Capitol Hill. My focus was budget and tax policy, but I also had the opportunity to do a lot of writing on diplomacy. For 12 years, I had a column on diplomacy in which I profiled leading diplomats, and that was what led me to write some books on both diplomacy and politics. I went to graduate school in Washington at a school that focused on international affairs, and as I finished up that program, I had heard about an opportunity to be a reporter for a small financial wire called Market News International. I took the position and thought I'd do it for a year, and 26 years later I was finishing up there, but it was a great job. I had complete independence. I would check in with my boss once or twice a day, but I was working out of the Capitol and covering budget and tax policy, trying to find specific angles that would be interesting to our readership. So that was great. And then as the diplomatic part of my life was great. Countries send their really best diplomats to Washington, and had a chance to interview a number of them and really get a sense of how diplomacy works at a very high level. I think the culture has shifted in a negative way. I think it's gotten far more coarse, far more contentious, far more polarized, far less willingness to reach across the aisle and cooperate and collaborate. I think it's the conflict in American politics is substantial, and I think it's actually fueled to some extent by the media and the press that tends to focus on conflict and confrontation. Conflict sells in a way that quiet talks to reach an agreement just doesn't. So I think there's a real focus on conflict and confrontation. Following on my earlier point, there is a focus on conflict, and so occasionally my bosses, would say, how come you don't, they would at least question if I was missing part of the story by not focusing, sufficiently on conflict and confrontation. But I usually was able to make I think a pretty reasonable case that I was putting the right emphasis on the story, that I was focusing on things that were factually sound, and so I really didn't feel like I had to change. I didn't feel like my values were really threatened or challenged in any particular way. I think the pressure has escalated, and I think the important thing would be to find, I think there are niches of the journalism world that those pressures are not as acute, the focus is not as relentless on conflict and confrontation. So I think it makes a lot of sense for reporters to look at those kind of niches where that pressure is not there. As an example, I was a feature writer for the Washington Diplomat. I still am. I do features for them. And I think feature writing allows you oftentimes to, first of all, find subjects who you find interesting, and oftentimes you'd find them interesting, or at least I would, because they're doing constructive things. And so I think feature writing sometimes allows you the freedom to focus on a more positive or more positive and constructive angle. I should say, there's plenty of feature writing where people go after others and expose duplicity and dishonesty and so forth. So I don't want to be unrealistic about some of the strictures of feature writing, but I think that's one niche of the industry that allows one to not be as pulled into the confrontation metric, if it were. What we're trying to do is create some programs to make town hall meetings in Illinois more civil. We're trying to create a program to get students to come up with some ideas on how to renew and to rebuild Illinois. And we're creating a program to encourage statesmanship at both the state level and the national level, and also international level, and then also the local level. So statesmanship at really all levels of government. And statesmanship, we mean an approach to government that looks to the long term, that tries to solve problems in a constructive way, that is built on fairness and compassion and effectiveness. So our hope is that the statesmanship program will help teach younger students that the United States has conducted government better than it's now conducting it, and also to remind older people of my generation that we once did government much better than we are now, and that there's no reason that we cannot elevate our game considerably. I think the immediate solution is for citizens to expect more out of their policymakers, their lawmakers, their representatives. I think it's important for citizens to understand the issues and to vote for people who are problem solvers rather than flamethrowers. I think that is something that people can do, and there's a tendency to kind of give your party a pass and just be very critical of the other party, but just look away at the deficiencies of your party. And I think it's important to be fair-minded and to hold your people to even a higher standard than you hold those of the other party. I don't know, other than to present historical examples, concrete examples of human beings, flawed people, who have tried to conduct their public service on a higher level and a more elevated level. I think we have examples of these people from not even that distant of a past. And I think as students actually saw concrete, tangible examples of these sorts of this sort of leadership and understood the trade-offs people made and the decisions they made, I think these historical examples can be quite illuminating and also inspiring. I would recommend Arthur Vandenberg, a senator from Michigan, a Republican senator, who worked with Democratic President Harry Truman to help enact the Marshall Plan and to construct NATO. I would suggest they look at former Republican Senator Howard Baker, who was willing to put his own presidential aspirations in jeopardy by working with President Jimmy Carter in 1977 on the Panama Canal treaties. I would urge him to look at someone like Senator Lugar, who worked with President Obama. And I'd also urge him to look at international figures like a Nelson Mandela, who was able to emerge from more than 25 years in prison and conduct himself without bitter or acrimony or rancor. We're going to encourage him to look at someone like Mikhail Gorbachev, who was willing to break out of the strictures of the Cold War. So I think there's a lot of good examples that people can draw from, and to both learn the lessons of individual lives and also to find inspiration for themselves. One of the most practical things I think that we need to expect from our political leaders is just basic honesty and directness. And one of the reasons I have deep admiration for Paul Simon, whose institute I now run, is that he had an ability to just speak the truth without apology, without acrimony, with civility, and just tell people what he thought, and not to trim his sails and try to tell people what he thought they wanted to hear, but just what he believed. And I think if we can have leaders along those lines, I think the public might react in a way that's more positive than people believe to just simple truth-telling. So I think people should reward truth-tellers, and I think we should hope and push our public officials to speak as honestly and directly as possible. One of my favorite stories about Paul Simon was that at one point he received a very angry letter from a constituent who challenged him on an issue and wrote a very angry, bitter letter and said, Senator Simon, I disagree with you so strongly on this issue. I'm so angry at you, and so forth. And Senator Simon responded by saying a very polite, civil, elevated letter in which he said, thank you for the letter. I understand your view. It seems like on this issue you believe it, and you believe it very strongly. On that same issue, this is what I believe, and I believe it very strongly. So if this is a really important issue for you, you should vote for someone else. He didn't try to demonize the other person or challenge their motives or their patriotism or tell them they're dumb or stupid. He just said, this is what I believe, and if you believe differently, you have the right to vote for someone who's more in line with your views. And I think that simple story, when I tell it, resonates so much with all audiences. There's a sense of, so you can actually participate in politics at a high level and conduct yourself like that. And so that, in that sense, I think Simon's story is quite an inspiring one.
Yeah, it sure is. That is fantastic. I'm looking forward to more public figures going back to that.
I am too.
So thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you.